The September morning in the county of Essex was unseasonably raw. A thick, clinging fog, heavy as unwashed flannel, crept down from the crowns of the elms and settled upon the grass of North Weald Aerodrome in a gray, weeping dew. Frank Matthews, who only yesterday had worn the chevrons of a corporal in the United States Army, and today stood clad in the slate-blue uniform of the Royal Air Force, waited at the edge of the flight line. His lungs still held the dry, searing heat of Texas, and this English air felt unfit for breathing. It had to be chewed, like tasteless porridge. Before him, sheltered beneath a garnish of camouflage netting, rested the fighter. Back in the States, Frank had climbed into the cockpits of heavy, substantial machines that smelled of fresh leather and factory lacquer. They inspired confidence through their sheer mass, their abundance of gauges, and their cavernous cockpits where one could turn around without catching an elbow on the flap lever. The Supermarine Spitfire Mark V-B looked, by comparison, like a graceful but lethal straight razor left in the grass by a giant. They didn't build her, Frank. They honed her out of a single block of steel and stubbornness, a voice rasped behind him. It was the rigger, an elderly Briton with hands permanently reddened by the biting wind. Matthews stepped closer. The elliptical wings, thin and broad, looked almost too delicate to carry the weight of the two heavy Hispano cannons that jutted hungrily from the leading edges. Frank touched the duralumin skin. It was cold and slick with condensation. He swung himself up onto the wing, careful not to slip on the black walkway, and peered into the office. The first sensation was a twinge of claustrophobia. This was not a pilot's workstation in the American sense. It was a narrow steel cocoon. The fuselage sides pinched inward so tightly that the Texan's broad shoulders were destined to graze the frames. Instead of the familiar straight control stick topped with a cluster of buttons, Frank saw something alien. A slender column terminating in a circular ring, the famous spade grip. "Squeeze yourself in, lad," the rigger encouraged. "Mind the side door, though. It isn't there for decoration. It's so you don't skin your elbows every time you settle in." Frank lowered himself into the bucket seat. The feeling was instantaneous. He hadn't climbed into a plane. He had put it on, like a bespoke suit tailored one size too small across the chest. His boots found the rudder pedals, and his eyes immediately sought the brake lever. It was right there on the spade grip, a single, bicycle-like handle for both wheels. Instruction manuals flashed through his mind. If you want to turn on the ground, squeeze the lever on the stick and kick the corresponding pedal. The pneumatics will do the rest. It felt primitive. In American machines, the brakes were toe-actuated and independent on each pedal, intuitive and sturdy. Here, it required the coordination of a circus performer. Ahead, through the armored glass of the windscreen, the long cowling of the Merlin engine sloped away. Despite the cramped quarters, the visibility was startling. The canopy, with its characteristic Malcolm bulge, allowed him to see almost everything behind his shoulders, a luxury denied to the pilots of the early Curtiss machines. Frank wrapped his fingers around the spade. The stick moved with an alarming lack of resistance, almost as if it were floating in oil. He knew that at 400 miles per hour, this sensitivity would turn a mere thought into a violent maneuver. He took a deep breath, the scent of high-octane fuel and stale glycol filling his nostrils, and looked at the instrument panel. There were no gleaming, modern dials here, only the stark, functional faces of British engineering. "She's a lady, Frank," the rigger shouted over the rising wind, "but she's a lady with a very short temper. Treat her like a Cadillac, and she'll throw you into the hedge. Treat her like a thoroughbred, and she'll dance for you." Frank nodded, his thumb hovering over the brass firing button on the grip. He wasn't just joining a squadron. He was entering a different philosophy of flight. The Merlin engine did not merely start. It awakened with a violent, rhythmic cough that shook the very marrow of Frank's bones. A cloud of black, oily smoke momentarily obscured the pristine view from the canopy, and then the 12 cylinders settled into a deep, predatory growl. Frank felt the heat of the coolant radiating through the thin firewall, a reminder that he was sitting inches away from more than 1,000 horsepower of British engineering. "Chocks away!" The rigger's voice was lost to the wind, but his frantic waving told the story. Frank gingerly squeezed the brake lever on the spade grip. He kicked the right rudder pedal and felt the Spitfire lurch into a turn. It was a clumsy, zigzagging dance. To see over that long, sloping nose while taxiing, he had to swing the tail back and forth, peering out the side of the bulged canopy. Every time he applied the brakes, the hiss of the pneumatic system sounded like a disgruntled serpent. In a P-40, he would have felt like he was driving a truck. Here, he felt like he was balancing a bicycle on a tightrope. He reached the downwind end of the grass strip and turned into the wind. The pre-flight checklist was a mantra whispered against the roar. Trim tabs neutral, mixture rich, pitch fully fine. He took a breath, tasted the metallic tang of his own adrenaline, and pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was not the heavy, gathering shove of an American fighter. It was a sudden, soaring leap. The tail came up almost instantly, and suddenly the horizon was level, framed by the thin, vibrating edges of the engine cowling. Within 500 feet, the grass fell away. Frank retracted the landing gear, hearing the mechanical thunk of the wheels locking into the wells, and then it happened. He made a slight, almost unconscious correction to level the wings. In a Thunderbolt, such a movement would have resulted in a gentle roll. The Spitfire, however, snapped to the left so violently that Frank's head struck the side of the canopy. "Good God," he exhaled, his voice thin in the radio mask. It wasn't a plane. It was a nervous system with wings. He barely touched the spade grip and the machine pirouetted. He pulled back an inch and the G-force pressed him into the bucket seat as the nose clawed at the clouds. The controls were so light, so sensitive, that it felt as if the Spitfire were reading his thoughts before his muscles could even react. He leveled out at 5,000 feet, the patchwork quilt of the English countryside spread out beneath a thin veil of mist. He threw the ship into a steep bank. The elliptical wings bit into the air, carving a turn so tight that he felt the blood drain from his head. No American machine he had ever flown could turn on a dime like this. It was a ballet in the stratosphere, a graceful, lethal agility that made the heavy fighters of his homeland feel like lumbering coal barges. But the lady had her quirks. As he leveled off and playfully shoved the stick forward to dive, the Merlin engine gave a sickening, hollow cough. The power vanished for a terrifying heartbeat. The float chamber, Frank remembered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Unlike the fuel-injected engines he was used to, the British carburetor couldn't handle negative G-forces. The fuel simply floated away from the jets, starving the engine. He quickly pulled back, and the Merlin roared back to life with a defiant spit of flame from the exhausts. "Semi-roll, Frank," he muttered to himself, recalling the briefing. "Pull, don't push." He spent the next 20 minutes getting acquainted with his new partner. He learned the strange tension of the spade grip at high speeds and the way the air whistled through the gun ports. By the time he circled back toward North Weald, the Texan knew one thing for certain. He would never look at a cockpit the same way again. He was no longer a driver. He was a pilot. The chalkboard in the briefing room at North Weald was a chaotic map of intersecting white lines, representing the geometric dance of death over the English Channel. Flight Lieutenant Stuffy Bowmont, a man whose mustache seemed to have seen more combat than most pilots, tapped a wooden pointer against a diagram of a Messerschmitt 109. "The Jerry won't turn with you, gentlemen," Beaumont clipped, his voice dry as parchment. "He knows the Spitfire will out-curb him every time, so he will dive. He will shove his nose down and vanish into the haze, counting on his fuel injection to keep his engine screaming while yours chokes on its own spit." Frank sat in the back row, his notebook open, but his mind was back in the cockpit. He had felt that terrifying silence 2 days ago, that sudden, hollow gasp of the Merlin when he had tried to follow a simulated target into a dive. It was a mechanical frailty that felt like a betrayal. In a Curtiss or a Republic fighter, you pushed the nose down and the power followed you. Here, the laws of physics played a different game. Gravity is your enemy in the transition, Bowmont continued, circling a point on the board. The float in your carburetor doesn't know up from down when the G-force goes negative. It rises, cuts the fuel, and leaves you as a very graceful, very quiet glider. The veteran pilot turned to the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the American volunteers. The solution is the semi-roll. You don't dive. You roll the lady onto her back, pull the spade grip toward your belt, and let the positive G's keep the petrol flowing. It's an extra second of work, but it's the second that keeps you from being a sitting duck. After the briefing, Frank walked out to the line where his Mark 5B, tailcode XR-D, waited under a pale, watery sun. The mechanics were busy adjusting the tension on the control cables. Frank climbed up the wing root, his movements becoming more fluid, the narrowness of the cockpit starting to feel less like a prison and more like a well-worn glove. He taxied out, the hiss-click of the pneumatic brakes now a familiar rhythm. Once airborne, he climbed to 10,000 feet, the Merlin humming a steady, reassuring baritone. It was time to break the habit of a lifetime. He picked a landmark, a bend in the Blackwater River, and imagined a sleek gray and yellow nose diving away from him. His instinct screamed at him to shove the stick forward. Instead, Frank slammed the spade grip to the left. The Spitfire snapped over with a violence that made the airframe groan. Hanging upside down in his straps, looking at the green earth through the top of the canopy, he pulled back. The G-force hit him instantly, 3 times his own weight pressing him into the seat, but the Merlin didn't falter. It roared with a clean, uninterrupted ferocity as the nose carved a great arc through the sky. He rolled wings level at the bottom of the maneuver, his heart racing. He had traded a straight line for a curve, but he had kept his sting. "Not bad, Tex," a voice crackled in his earphones. It was Bowmont, loitering 1,000 feet above in his own Mark 5. "But you're still thinking like a truck driver. You're fighting the air. Stop trying to steer the plane and start trying to be the plane. Let the wings do the breathing for you." Frank wiped a bead of sweat from his eye. He realized that the British didn't fly for speed or for ruggedness. They flew for the turn. Every inch of the Spitfire was designed to win a circle, to narrow the world until only the enemy's tail remained in the center of the ring. The sky over the Essex coast was a canvas of pale, watery blue, streaked with the high, white feathers of cirrus clouds. Frank leveled his Mark 5B at 12,000 feet, his eyes scanning the empty air for Stuffy Bowmont. In a mock dogfight, the first rule was simple. The man who saw the other first usually won the right to sit on a bar stool that evening without buying the rounds. "Careful, Tex," Beaumont's voice crackled, sounding deceptively relaxed. "I'm in the sun, or perhaps I'm behind that cloud, or perhaps I'm already closing on your tail." Frank didn't answer. He tightened his harness until the straps dug into his collarbones, merging himself with the vibrating metal of the seat. He didn't look for a plane. He looked for a speck, a glitch in the horizon, a flash of light off a canopy. Then he saw it. A shadow flitting across the white edge of a cloud bank 4 o'clock high. Instead of turning toward the threat, Frank slammed the spade grip to the left and kicked the rudder. The Spitfire snapped into a violent roll. He didn't pull back immediately. He let the nose drop, building speed, feeling the Merlin engine sing as the airspeed indicator needle swept past 300 miles per hour. "Going somewhere?" Beaumont's voice was closer now. The veteran was diving, his Spitfire growing larger in Frank's rearview mirror. Frank waited. His hand on the spade grip was light, almost delicate, despite the roar of the wind through the gun ports. He counted to 3, then hauled back. The G-force hit him like a physical blow, dragging the skin of his face downward and graying the edges of his vision. The Spitfire didn't protest. It didn't shudder or buffet like the heavy American fighters he had flown in the States. It simply bit into the air and turned. Frank carved a circle so tight it felt as if he were trying to bite his own tail. In the center of that circle, Beaumont's machine suddenly appeared, overshooting the mark. The veteran had expected the American to dive or run. He hadn't expected him to use the Spitfire's turning radius to essentially stop in midair and let the attacker fly past. "Well, well," Bowmont muttered, "the cowboy has found his spurs." Now it was Frank's turn. He reversed the bank, the semi-roll becoming second nature. He kept the positive G's high, the Merlin screaming with uninterrupted power. He saw the brown and green camouflage of Beaumont's wings through the top of his canopy. He stayed in the turn, hauling back until the spade grip was nearly at his stomach. The Spitfire groaned, the rivets straining, but it held the line. He settled the orange ring of the reflector sight onto the tail of Beaumont's machine. He didn't press the button, but in his mind, he felt the heavy thud of the cannons. "Got you, Stuffy," Frank whispered into the mask. "So you have, Tex, so you have," Bowmont replied, rocking his wings in acknowledgement. "But remember, a Messerschmitt won't wait for you to finish your ballet. He'll dive at 400 knots and leave you clutching at the air. You've learned to dance, lad. Now you have to learn to kill." As they broke formation to head back to Northweald, Frank looked down at his gloved hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. It was the vibration of the machine, a resonance that seemed to have moved from the engine through the airframe and directly into his blood. He wasn't just an American in a British uniform anymore. He was a part of the sky. The Armory at Northweald was a sanctuary of cold, blued steel, permeated by a sharp, almost tactile scent of gun oil and the dry, acrid dust of cordite. Outside, the rain had returned, the customary accompaniment of an English autumn, drumming a steady, monotonous rhythm against the corrugated iron roof of the hangar. Frank Matthews stood over a long workbench of weathered oak, watching as two armorers, men with graphite grease permanently etched into the lines of their palms, labored over a disassembled 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon. Stripped of its aerodynamic fairings, the weapon looked less like a piece of aviation equipment and more like a heavy industrial engine, a brutal progeny of the machine age. "In the States, Frank, you were likely raised on the Browning .50 caliber," Sergeant Miller said without looking up. His face was a map of grease stains and old scars, his voice rasping like a file on iron. "Fine tools, those, reliable as a church clock. You can hold the spade grip down, spray the sky with lead for half a minute, and trust that enough of that metal will stick to a Junkers to bring him down. It is a war of attrition, the American way. You carry thousands of rounds, and you spend them like a drunken sailor in a dockside pub." Frank nodded slowly, his mind drifting back to the vast, sun-drenched runways of Texas. He remembered the heavy belts of ammunition being fed into the wings of the P-47, thousands of rounds of .50 caliber lead. In those cockpits, you felt like a god of thunder. You had the luxury of a long burst, a margin for error that allowed you to hose the target until it disintegrated. "But this," Miller said, tapping the long, cold barrel of the Hispano with a wrench, "this is a different animal entirely. This is a surgeon's scalpel, if the surgeon were a raving madman. One explosive shell from this beauty will peel a Messerschmitt's wing off like a tin of sardines. It doesn't just punch holes, it removes structural integrity. But there is a price for such power, lad. A very steep price." The sergeant stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. He gestured toward the wing of Frank's Spitfire, where the ammunition drums were being prepared. "You have 60 rounds per gun. 60. At the Hispano's rate of fire, that gives you barely 6 seconds of sustained combat. 6 seconds between being the apex predator of the channel and being a very expensive, very defenseless glider. In the States, you fly a brawler. Here, you fly a duelist. If you miss your opening thrust, you don't get a second chance to apologize." Frank walked over to his Mark 5B, tail code XR-D, which sat bathed in the dim amber light of the hangar. The armorers were sliding the heavy, circular drums into the wing bays with a series of metallic clunks that echoed in the cavernous space. He looked at the asymmetric arrangement: 2 20mm cannons and 4 .33 caliber machine guns. It was a mismatched orchestra of destruction. The light machine guns were the finders, used to walk the tracers onto the target, but the cannons were the closers. He climbed into the cockpit, not to fly, but to immerse himself in the grim arithmetic of the machine. He settled into the bucket seat, the familiar scent of stale glycol and high-octane fuel rising to meet him. He wrapped his hand around the spade grip, his thumb hovering over the brass firing button. It had a sliding safety catch that clicked with a definitive, lethal snap. 60 rounds. 6 seconds. He closed his eyes and tried to visualize the deflection. In a high-speed turn where the G-force was pulling the blood from his brain and the Spitfire was screaming at the edge of a stall, he would have to find the discipline to wait. He would have to resist the American instinct to pour it on. He had to wait until the enemy's fuselage filled the orange ring of the reflector sight, until he could see the oil streaks on the German's cowling and the terrified face of the pilot in the rearview mirror. Only then could he afford the 2-second burst. "The weight of the caliber," Frank whispered, the words muffled by the silence of the hangar. He felt the immense responsibility of those 12 shells per second. Back home, a pilot was a technician, part of a vast industrial machine that relied on volume. Here, under the gray, low-hanging clouds of England, a pilot was a marksman. He reached out and touched the Grimstone reflector sight. In the half-light, the glass seemed to glow with a ghostly, predatory luminescence. He thought about the men he would face, pilots from the Luftwaffe who had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War, men who knew exactly how long a Spitfire could spit fire before its throat went dry. The Texan realized then that the Spitfire's legendary maneuverability wasn't a luxury. It was a desperate necessity. You had to be able to outturn the world because you only had 6 seconds to win the war. He sat there for a long time, the rain continuing its relentless assault on the roof, feeling the ghost of the machine's power vibrating through the floorboards. He wasn't just learning to fly a different airframe. He was learning a new, cold philosophy of violence where every bullet was a heartbeat, and he only had 60 heartbeats to give. The sun had long since surrendered to the horizon, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum that rapidly deepened into a void of obsidian. Night at North Weald brought a different kind of tension, a silence broken only by the rhythmic, distant thud of anti-aircraft batteries testing their traverse along the coast. Frank Matthews sat in the ready room, his flight suit heavy with the cold, damp air of the Nissen hut. A single shaded lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the walls, where maps of the Reich and silhouettes of the Junkers 88 were pinned like trophies. The scramble bell didn't ring. It shrieked, a piercing mechanical scream that tore through the stillness. Frank was on his feet before his brain had fully processed the sound. "Night intruder reported over the Thames estuary," the duty officer barked, his voice tight. "Vector 090, Angels 10, go!" Frank ran. The grass of the airfield was slick with frost, his boots sliding as he hauled himself up onto the wing of XR-D. The cockpit was a black pit, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the radium-painted dials. There was no time for the methodical checks of the morning. He primed the Merlin, the smell of raw, high-octane fuel stinging his nostrils, and hit the starter. The engine roared, a blue-white flame stabbing out from the exhaust stacks, momentarily blinding him. He slammed the canopy shut, the world shrinking to the size of his instrument panel. Taking off into the black was an act of pure faith. Without the horizon, the Spitfire felt like a wild animal trying to shake him off. Frank stared at the artificial horizon, his world reduced to a tiny wooden bird hovering between two white lines. He retracted the gear, the thunk echoing through the airframe, and climbed. At 10,000 feet, the temperature dropped precipitously. The heater in the Spitfire was a joke, a meager breath of warmth that barely reached his knees while his fingers turned to ice inside his leather gloves. "Red 2, this is Control," the radio crackled with static, the voice sounding thin and distant. "Target is 4 miles ahead, crossing left to right. Height 9,000. Watch for the exhaust flames." Frank squinted through the armored windscreen. The night was not truly black. It was a sea of shifting grays and charcoal shadows. He throttled back, trying to quiet the Merlin, feeling the airframe vibrate with a low, predatory hum. Then he saw it. Two tiny, flickering stubs of orange light dancing in the void. Exhaust flames. It was a Junkers 88, a twin-engine Marauder prowling the English darkness. Frank moved the spade grip with the delicacy of a watchmaker. He didn't want to alert the rear gunner. He slipped into the dead man's zone, directly beneath and behind the bomber's tail. The silhouette of the Junkers began to blot out the stars, a massive, predatory shape looming over him. His heart hammered against his ribs, the thud, thud of his pulse competing with the steady drone of the Merlin. He reached for the safety catch on the spade grip. Click. The cannons were live. He remembered Sergeant Miller's words, 60 rounds, 6 seconds. In the dark, distance was an illusion. He needed to be close enough to smell the German's oil. He watched the orange reticle of the Grimstone sight. The Junkers grew larger, its twin rudders framing the glass. Suddenly, the night exploded. The German rear gunner had spotted the silhouette of the Spitfire against the faint glow of the moon. Tracers, bright, lethal pearls of white light, streaked past Frank's canopy, so close he could see the spiral of their flight. He didn't panic. He didn't pull away. If he broke now, he would lose the target in the dark and be hunted in turn. He kicked the rudder, slipping the Spitfire to the side to avoid the stream of fire, and then hauled back on the spade grip. The nose rose, the orange ring of the sight settling onto the Junker's right engine. One heartbeat. He squeezed the brass button. The Spitfire bucked beneath him as the 20mm Hispanos spoke. It wasn't a rat-tat-tat like the machine guns. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud that vibrated through his boots and teeth. Bright flashes of cordite fire erupted from his wings, momentarily washing the cockpit in a harsh, strobe-like glare. He saw the shells strike. The right engine of the Junkers didn't just smoke, it disintegrated. A spectacular fountain of white-hot magnesium and burning oil erupted into the night. Frank held the trigger for exactly 2 seconds, 36 rounds of high-explosive fury. The bomber tilted violently to the right, its wings shedding burning fragments like a dying comet. Frank dove beneath the wreckage, feeling the heat of the explosion wash over his canopy. He looked back and saw a single parachute blossom in the dark, a pale ghost descending toward the cold waters of the estuary. Frank's hands were shaking as he leveled the wings. He looked at his ammunition counters. He had less than half his shells left. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving him shivering in the sub-zero air. He had won his first night duel, but the victory felt heavy. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a component of the machine, a silent executor of the grim arithmetic he had learned in the hangar. "Red 2 to control," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Target destroyed. Vector me home. I'm cold and I'm out of time." As he turned back toward North Weald, the faint glow of the radium dials seemed to pulse like a living heart. He had crossed a line in the darkness, and he knew that the boy from Texas who had arrived in England 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by something much harder, forged in the cramped, freezing cockpit of a Spitfire. The morning of the Circus mission did not begin with the romantic roar of engines, but with the cold, sterile light of the briefing room and the smell of stale tobacco. A circus was the RAF's term for a deliberate provocation, a small force of light bombers, usually Bostons or Blenheims, sent across the channel as tethered goats to draw the Luftwaffe's predatory Focke-Wulfs into a hornet's nest of Spitfires. "Target is the power station at Mazengarb," Wing Commander Scott announced, his pointer tapping a sharp rhythm against the wall map. "The Bostons will fly at 12,000. 71st and 121 will provide the high cover at 24,000. Our job is simple, gentlemen. Keep the Abbeville boys off the bombers' tails. If you see a Focke-Wulf, don't chase him down to the deck. Stay high, stay fast, and keep your eyes peeled for the sun." Frank Matthews sat in the front row, his flight suit already damp with perspiration despite the morning chill. The Abbeville boys, Jagdgeschwader 26, were the elite of the Luftwaffe, flying the new Focke-Wulf 190. While the Spitfire could outturn almost anything, the Butcher Bird, as they called the German fighter, was a master of the dive and the roll. It was a heavy hitter, a bruiser that didn't want to dance, it wanted to ambush. As Frank climbed into XRD on the perimeter track, the atmosphere at North Weald was different from the lonely tension of the night intercept. The air was thick with the synchronized thunder of 36 Merlin engines, a mechanical symphony that vibrated in the very soil of Essex. He taxied out in a long line of camouflaged hunters, the dust from the leading aircraft's prop wash coating his windscreen in a fine, gritty film. "Check oxygen techs," his wingman, a skinny kid from Nebraska named Miller, crackled over the radio. "It's going to be thin up there." "Roger, Miller. Keep it tight. Don't go hunting for glory," Frank replied, his voice sounding metallic in the rubber mask. The climb was long and punishing. As the altimeter needle swept past 15,000 feet, the vibrant greens of England faded into a hazy, indistinct tapestry of gray and blue. At 24,000 feet, the world changed. The sky above was a deep, terrifying violet, and the sun was a blinding white coin that seemed to strip away all shadows. Frank adjusted his goggles, the cold now a constant, gnawing presence that seeped through his sheepskin-lined boots. Below them, the 6 Boston bombers looked like tiny, silver minnows swimming through a vast sapphire sea. They were the bait. "Tally-ho! 10 o'clock high! Bandits!" The wing commander's voice lost its BBC composure, turning sharp and jagged. Frank looked up and left. Out of the white glare of the sun, a dozen dark specks were growing with sickening speed. They weren't turning, they were falling, trailing thin ribbons of black smoke from their radial engines. The Focke-Wulfs were executing a classic boom and zoom attack. "Brake left! Brake left!" Frank slammed the spade grip to the side, the Spitfire responding with its characteristic lightning-fast snap. The G-force clawed at his chest, trying to flatten him against the seat as he hauled the nose into a steep, climbing turn. A streak of gray passed beneath his wing. A Focke-Wulf 190, its blunt nose and wide-track gear visible for a split second before it vanished into the haze below. "Miller, stay with me!" Frank shouted, but the Nebraska kid was already gone, pulled away by the chaotic centrifugal force of the dogfight. The sky, which had been empty a moment ago, was suddenly a swirling hive of contrails and tracer fire. It was no longer a structured mission. It was a furball, a desperate scramble for survival where the horizon swapped places with the sun every 3 seconds. Frank saw a Spitfire from 121 Squadron erupt in a ball of orange flame, its wing fluttering away like a falling leaf. There was no time for grief. A shadow flickered over Frank's canopy. He looked back and saw the terrifying sight of 4 20-millimeter cannon muzzles flashing from the wing roots of a Focke-Wulf. The German pilot was good. He wasn't trying to outturn Frank. He was using his superior roll rate to stay out of phase, banking his heavy machine back and forth to keep his sights on the Spitfire's cockpit. Frank felt the thud, thud, thud of explosive shells striking his tail assembly. The control cable shrieked in protest, and the spade grip began to vibrate with a sickening, ragged flutter. "Not today, Hans," Frank hissed through clenched teeth. He pushed the nose down into a violent negative G dive, forgetting for a heartbeat the lessons of Miss Schilling. The Merlin stumbled, the power cutting out as the fuel floated in the carburetor. The silence was deafening, but it was exactly what he needed. The Focke-Wulf, expecting the Spitfire to pull up into a turn, overshot. Frank slammed the spade grip into a semi-roll, gravity pulling the fuel back into the jets. The Merlin caught with a roar of blue flame. He was now behind the Butcher Bird. He had 6 seconds of fire left in his wings. He settled the orange reticle on the German's broad, armored back. The distance was closing. 400 yards. 300. 200. He could see the black crosses on the wings and the modeling of the camouflage. He squeezed the button. The Spitfire bucked, its Hispanos screaming their heavy, rhythmic song. The impact of the 20mm shells was not a subtle thing. Through the vibrating glass of his windscreen, Frank saw the heavy, high-explosive rounds strike the wing root of the Focke-Wulf with the brilliance of miniature suns. The German machine, which had seemed so invincible and solid only a heartbeat before, suddenly began to shed its structural integrity. A jagged slab of duralumin, the fairing for the landing gear, ripped away and whipped past Frank's canopy like a lethal blade. "Direct hits! Right wing root!" Frank's own voice sounded distant to him, muffled by the adrenaline thundering in his ears. He didn't let go of the spade grip. He held the burst for a full 3 seconds, nearly half of his remaining combat life. The Focke-Wulf shuddered under the rhythmic hammering of the Hispanos. Then, a spectacular secondary explosion erupted from the Germans' wing root fuel tank. A geyser of white-hot flame and thick, oily smoke engulfed the Butcherbird's cockpit. The aircraft rolled violently to the right, falling away toward the shimmering blue expanse of the English Channel 4 miles below. There was no parachute. "Red 2 to leader, 1 bandit down," Frank panted, trying to stabilize his breathing. But the victory was short-lived. As he attempted to level his wings, the Spitfire refused to obey. The spade grip felt sickeningly light in his hand, then suddenly jammed as if a steel bar had been wedged into the gears. He looked back over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. The tail assembly of XRD was a jagged ruin. The Focke-Wulf's 20mm shells had chewed through the rudder fabric and severed 2 of the 4 elevator control cables. "Miller! Miller, do you read me?" Frank shouted into the mask. Silence. The radio was dead, likely severed by the same burst that had mangled his tail. He was alone, 20,000 feet above the French coast, with a crippled airplane and a sky still swarming with angry gray and yellow hunters. The Spitfire began a slow, rhythmic oscillation, a pitch bucking that threatened to shake the Merlin right out of its mountings. Frank gripped the spade ring with both hands, his knuckles white through his leather gloves. He had to find a balance between the remaining cables and the trim tabs. He reached down to the trim wheel, his fingers fumbling with the frozen metal, and began to dial in nose-down compensation. Every time he moved the stick, the snapped cables lashed against the interior of the fuselage with a sound like a whip crack. "Come on, you beautiful British bitch," he hissed, his boots fighting the erratic pulses of the rudder pedals. "Don't quit on me now, we're almost to the water." Below him, the French coastline, the Pas de Calais, slid by with agonizing slowness. He could see the white surf breaking against the cliffs of Gris-Nez, a border between life and a German prison camp. To his left, he saw a pair of specks diving from the sun. His heart hammered. If they were Focke-Wulfs, he was a dead man. He couldn't turn, couldn't dive, and his cannons were likely dry. The specks grew larger, resolving into the familiar elliptical silhouettes of Spitfires. It was Miller and Bowmont. They swept in on either side of his battered wingtips, their presence a silent armored shield. Bowmont rocked his wings, his thumb pointed toward the English coast. The crossing of the channel felt like it lasted 1,000 years. The Merlin, usually so smooth, began to run rough, its temperature gauges creeping into the red as the radiator, peppered with shrapnel, started to bleed glycol. A thin mist of the sweet-smelling toxic coolant began to spray over Frank's boots. "Keep her nose up, Tex," he whispered to the cockpit. "Just 10 more miles." The white cliffs of Dover finally rose out of the haze like the teeth of a giant. They were beautiful, stark, and solid. Frank didn't head for North Weald. He wouldn't make it that far. He steered for the emergency strip at Manston, right on the coast. Landing a crippled Spitfire with severed elevator cables was like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. He couldn't flare the nose, he had to fly the plane onto the grass using the throttle and the trim wheel. As the wheels touched the turf, the tail-heavy machine bounced violently. Frank fought the spade grip, his muscles screaming under the strain. The Spitfire ground looped to the left, the wingtip digging into the soft earth before finally coming to a rest in a cloud of dust and steam. Silence returned to the cockpit, broken only by the tink, tink, tink of the cooling metal. Frank sat there for a long minute, his hands still locked on the spade grip. He smelled the burnt cordite, the leaked glycol, and his own salt-heavy sweat. He had survived his first circus, but the price of admission had been the near destruction of the finest machine he had ever known. He looked at the spade ring. It was bent slightly from his frantic grip. He had learned that day that the ballet of the sky was not just about grace. It was about the brutal, mechanical reality of staying alive when the world wanted to tear you apart. The memorandum arrived not with a flourish of trumpets, but in a mundane manila envelope carried by a dispatch rider whose motorcycle was caked in the yellow mud of the Essex lanes. It was late September, and the air at North Weald had turned sharp, carrying the scent of burning peat and the metallic tang of an approaching winter. Inside the officers' mess, the Eagle pilots of the 71st Squadron gathered around a scarred oak table, their RAF blue tunics standing out against the dark wood like a fading memory. "Effective immediately," Wing Commander Scott read, his voice devoid of its usual clipped authority. "The 71st, 121, and 133 Eagle Squadrons are hereby transferred from the Royal Air Force to the United States Army Air Forces. You will henceforth be designated as the 4th Fighter Group." A heavy silence followed. For months, Frank Matthews and his compatriots had lived in a strange liminal space. Americans fighting a British war, wearing British wool, and speaking a dialect of aviation that was entirely foreign to their brothers back in the States. They had learned to love the Spit, to respect the Merlin, and to trust the spade. Now, with a stroke of a pen in Washington and London, the identity they had forged in the fire over the Channel was being recalibrated. "Does this mean we get those new Thunderbolts?" Miller asked, his voice cracking slightly. The Nebraska kid looked down at his sleeve, tracing the RAF pilot's wings, the brevet, that sat above his left breast pocket. "The big jugs with the 8 guns and the radial engines?" "Eventually," Scott replied, looking Miller in the eye. "But for now, the 8th Air Force has seen fit to let you keep your Spitfires. They realize that trying to put a man who can dance into a suit of armor overnight is a recipe for disaster. You'll keep the Mark Vs, but you'll paint white stars over the roundels." Frank felt a knot of bittersweet tension tighten in his throat. He looked out the window toward the flight line, where XR-D stood. She had been patched and mended after the ordeal at Manston. New duralumin skin gleamed on her tail, and the elevator cables had been replaced with fresh, tensioned wire. She was no longer a stranger's machine. She was his. "It feels like we're deserting them," Frank whispered to Bowmont later that evening as they stood by the perimeter fence. The British pilot was leaning against a jeep, his pipe glowing a dull cherry red in the twilight. "Deserting? Nonsense, Tex," Bowmont grunted, exhaling a cloud of blue-gray smoke. "You're just putting on your own jersey for the second half of the game. We've taught you everything we know about the turn and the bank. Now you'll take that knowledge and apply it to your own doctrine. But I suspect you'll miss the lightness of the controls when they finally strap you into a 7-ton Republic fighter." Frank ran his hand along the fence wire. The transition was more than just a change of uniforms. It was a shift in the soul of their mission. As part of the RAF, they had been defenders of an island, specialists in the short, sharp duel. As part of the USAAF, they were becoming the vanguard of a global offensive. The ballet was about to become a brawl. The following morning, a team of painters arrived with buckets of olive drab and white. Frank watched from the cockpit as the familiar red, white, and blue circles on his wings vanished beneath the bold, 5-pointed stars of the United States. It felt like an act of erasure and an act of homecoming all at once. He settled into the seat, his fingers finding the spade grip. He closed his eyes and felt the familiar pinch of the cockpit against his shoulders. The scent was the same, the glycol, the high octane, the old leather. But as he looked at his sleeve and saw the U.S. insignia pinned to his collar, he realized the stakes had changed. He wasn't just a volunteer anymore. He was an officer of the United States Army, flying a British thoroughbred into a war that was rapidly outgrowing the individual heroism of the few. "One last season in the sun, XRD," Frank muttered, clicking the safety catch on the spade grip. "Let's show them how an American handles a lady." The first mission of the 4th Fighter Group, the newly minted Debden Eagles, felt like a funeral held in a thunderstorm. The late September sky was a bruised, churning mass of cumulonimbus, with rain lashing horizontally across the hardstand where XRD waited. Frank Matthews adjusted his new American life vest, the yellow Mae West, stark against the olive-drab tunic he now wore. On his shoulders, the silver bars of a first lieutenant caught the dim, watery light of a dying afternoon. "Look at us," Miller shouted over the howl of the wind, gesturing to his own uniform. "We look like we're heading to a parade in San Antonio, but we're still flying a plane that drinks tea and speaks with a BBC accent." Frank didn't smile. He climbed into the cockpit, noticing that the ground crew had already stenciled a small, white American star just below the windscreen. It looked out of place against the jagged, dark earth and ocean gray camouflage of the British fuselage. He settled into the bucket seat, the familiar pinch of the frames against his shoulders providing a strange, grounding comfort. "Battery master on," Frank whispered, his fingers moving through the cockpit drill with the fluidity of a pianist. The Merlin engine roared to life, but today the sound felt different. It was no longer the defiant cry of a besieged island. It was the opening note of a continental offensive. As he taxied out, Frank looked at the line of Spitfires. They were the same Mark Vs that had fought over Dunkirk and London, but they were now the instruments of a global power. The mission was a rodeo, a fighter sweep over the Saint-Omer region to harass German interceptors. As they crossed the coast at 20,000 feet, the cold was a physical weight, pressing against Frank's chest. The air was thin, the oxygen mask hissing with every labored breath. He looked to his left and saw Bowmont, still in his RAF blue, flying as a liaison officer in a lead Spitfire. They were a hybrid formation, a bridge between two worlds. "Red leader to Eagle Flight," Frank's voice was steady, stripped of its earlier Texan drawl. "Vector 120, watch the high cover. The sun is our enemy today." Suddenly, the gray ceiling above them shattered. A dozen BF-109s from Jagdgeschwader 2 came screaming down in a vertical dive. These weren't the butcher birds they had fought last week. These were the Messerschmitts, sleek, needle-nosed hunters that could outclimb almost anything in the sky. "Brake! Brake right!" Frank hauled the spade grip toward his hip. The Spitfire responded with its legendary, heart-stopping agility. Frank felt the G-force gray out his vision for a split second as he pulled 6 times his own weight. He stayed in the turn, the elliptical wings carving through the thin air like a surgeon's knife. He saw a Messerschmitt overshoot, its yellow nose flashing past his canopy. Frank didn't hesitate. He rolled the lady onto her back, executed a perfect semi-roll to keep the Merlin from coughing, and dived. He was no longer thinking about the controls. He was the controls. The spade grip was an extension of his own nervous system. He settled the orange reticle on the German's tail. 6 seconds. He squeezed the button. The Hispanos hammered out a 3-second burst, 36 rounds of high explosive punctuation. The Messerschmitt's tail disintegrated, the rudder fluttering away like a wounded bird. The German pilot bailed out, his white parachute a lonely flower in a sky of fire and smoke. "Good hit, Tex," Miller's voice crackled. "You sent him home early." As they turned back toward England, the sun began to set, casting a long, golden glow over the channel. Frank looked at the white star on his wing, now stained with a streak of black cordite soot from his own guns. He realized that this was the end of an era. Soon, the 4th Fighter Group would receive the massive P-47 Thunderbolts, 7-ton monsters of steel and fire that would trade the Spitfire's ballet for a brutal, high-altitude hammer blow. He touched the spade grip one last time, feeling the vibration of the Merlin as it hummed its steady, reliable song. He had come to England as a volunteer, a boy looking for adventure in a foreign uniform. He was leaving the Eagle Squadrons as a warrior, forged by a machine that had taught him the true meaning of grace under pressure. "We'll miss the lightness, won't we, girl?" he whispered to the instrument panel. As the wheels touched the grass of North Weald for the final time that season, Frank knew that the ballet was over. The war was moving into a different phase, one of massed formations, long-range escort, and industrial-scale destruction. But in his heart, he would always be a pilot of the 71st, a man who had learned to fly between the stars of his homeland and the soil of his host, held together by a slender column of steel and a circular grip called the spade. The Texan climbed out of the cockpit, saluted the rigger, and walked toward the Nissen huts. Behind him, the Spitfires sat in the deepening twilight, their elliptical wings silhouetted against the English sky, graceful, lethal, and forever legendary.